Well, hello, I'm Father Timothy Matkin, and this is Matins. I'm glad you've joined us. This is a kind of a special arrangement here. Today I want to do kind of a show and tell about the Anglican altar books that have been used over the years, what we call the Missals. The Missal is basically a book that has all of the parts for the Mass, hence the term Missal. There were some early versions of this called the Sacramentary that had perhaps some other sacraments as well included in the book. But as time went on, the way things tended to be organized is that the Missal would have everything for the Mass, and then you'd have another book, the Rituale, for some of the other sacraments and so on. But among Anglicans, when we talk about the Missal, usually what we're talking about is the book on the altar, because the prayer book is what's out in the pews, but they did a special version for the altar because you didn't need everything that was in the prayer. You didn't need 150 psalms up at the altar and that sort of thing. You just needed the parts that were used at the altar, the Eucharist. And so they put that together in a special book, of course made it larger print. And so among Anglicans, we've tended to refer to the altar book as the Missal. So when we talk about the Missal, that's usually what we're talking about. So I wanted to look at some of the ones that have come up over the years. Some of these are a part of my own collection. Most of these are a part of the collection here at my wonderful parish, St. Francis. We had a wonderful titular festival last Sunday, but very sadly we also had a parishioner that passed away yesterday. May she rest in peace. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. Well, before we get into the Anglican Missals, here is the Misale Romanum from 1962. This is my own copy, and you might think, well, why did you shell out all that money to get a Latin Missal? Well, of course, I'm interested in liturgy, so it's a prize, definitely. But I came across basically a deal that I couldn't pass up years and years ago, maybe even back in the 90s, I guess. Roman Catholic Books was offering a special sale on these, and I don't know if they're trying to get rid of their inventory or if they had a special sponsor underwriting it to promote this stuff. But anyway, I think it was marked down to like $50. So I'm like, well, I got to get one. And it's a very nice edition. I believe it is a reprint of a Binziger Brothers edition, but it doesn't say so inside. It just says reprint by Roman Catholic Books. And one thing that you'll notice is that every single word is in Latin, the whole thing. So this is, for example, just a part of the instructions. So here you have Ritus servandus in celebratione missae. In other words, how to use this book and how to celebrate the Mass. So all of the rubrics are in Latin. All of the scripture readings, everything from cover to cover, except for the note about this is reprinted by Roman Catholic Books, and the signature of John Cardinal O'Connor is in Latin. Also, another thing that may have made this a deal is that it came with a sticker that you put in the canon to add the name of St. Joseph, because St. Joseph was added to the canon by Pope John the 23rd, and that was like the one last final change of the 1962 last typical edition. And so that may have made this kind of a little bit less attractive, and so they marked down the price and so on. Anyway, you see how the text of the readings and the propers are a little bit bigger than the instruction in the front, and then when you get into the canon, everything is laid out even further. Everything tends to be bold as well. I'm not sure that exactly makes it easier to read. For me, I don't think so, but I guess that's up to various people's opinion. One thing you'll notice also, we came across it here, is all of the chant, all of the music is not in modern notation. So it's in the old, I guess you'd say Gregorian notation, the square note notation, where there's a 4-line staff instead of a 5-line staff. And for those not familiar with this and very familiar with the other, it can be, as I understand, sort of difficult to transition from one to the other. But for me, not reading music, but knowing these tunes by heart and just kind of following the ups and downs, for me, the Gregorian notation is a lot easier. For one thing, the way it's laid out, it's a lot closer to the words, and it can be sort of more compact together. And for me, it's just easier to follow the ups and downs and follow the tune. So this is the Misale Romanum. And of course, at the beginning of the canon, you always have a nice picture of the crucifixion scene or something along those lines. Now, this is something, and I think this was used here at St. Francis, but this is the granddaddy of them all, the Anglican Missal. So this is the one put out by the Society of Saints Peter and Paul. Let me see what the edition here is, 1939. And I'm sure this was not the first one, but this is basically all of the prayer book, along with all of the minor propers that go along with the readings, plus all the supplemental readings and propers for days not included in the prayer book calendar, other saints and days like Corpus Christi and Christ the King and those. This one's a little bit smaller in terms of the size of the page than some of the others, but it's a lot easier to read, I think. The bold is not quite as thick as in that last book, and for me, when it gets too bold, it gets more difficult for the eye. So I think this is a nice layout. If it were a little bit bigger page, it would be a little bit thinner book. This is an extremely large book. I mean, you look at that stack of pages there. This looks like one of those exhaustive dictionaries that you would find in an old library. Let me see how many pages we got here. The trouble is you have an additional section that starts over the numbering. But before you start the numbering over again, you get up to 1,345. So that's a lot of pages. One thing also interesting about this, the Anglican Missal, is that this was put together in a time when all of the prayer books around the world were basically very, very similar. All of the Sundays of the year would basically be the same. I don't know if there's any variation there. There'd be some slight variation in some places, like in the prayers of the people and in the canon. So this has, for example, the canon of all of the provinces of the Anglican Communion at that time, all the prayer books. So you open up, you find the English one, you find the Scottish one, you find the American canon, you find the one for India and South Africa and so on. So it's a book that could be used, at least at that time, all over the world. Of course, if you're going to do something like that today, it would be an extremely thick book. But perhaps you could do something that would be along the lines of an online database where you could have your tablet and you can just swipe the pages like that. Maybe we can put somebody to work putting that one together. Next one, let's look at this. So this is called The Altar Service. This was put out by the Episcopal Church. And as we were talking about earlier, basically it is the prayer book laid out as much as possible visually similar to the one in the pew. But of course it's larger print. It's also nice that it's two-toned, so the rubrics are in red. Of course, rubric means red, so that's where the word comes from. So all the instructions are separate in color from the text that is black, that is read out as the rite. But this doesn't have any extras in it, so it doesn't have any minor propers. When we talk about minor propers, what we're talking about is the introit, the gradual and Alleluia, or if it Lent, the tract, and the offertory, as well as the secret prayer. This is the prayer over the oblations, and let me see, the proper post-communion prayer and the communion verse. So those are all the minor propers. None of that is in here. And also, interestingly, it doesn't have any music in it. And I think because of that fact, it fueled interest in the Anglican Missal, because the Missal had all that music in it. And it's got the same Gregorian notation that we looked at earlier. But since this didn't have any music, well, you could invest in that Anglican Missal, and it would have all the music, and so you could do the chanting that you might want to do, which was picking up interest and speed at the time. As far as I know, they never did put out an altar edition with the chants in it. Of course, the chants were put out in other books, in the hymnal, and in some other musical supplements, I believe. But the Anglican Missal was the only one that had an altar book with the chants in it. Well, let's look at next this one that's called the Anglican Missal in the American edition. And so this one was taking that Anglican Missal from the Society of Saints Peter and Paul and putting it in basically all the American prayer book version stuff and leaving out all the English stuff and that from other places around the world. Now this has been reprinted this past year, I believe, by a continuing Anglican publishing house, I think run by the APA, the Anglican Province of America. I'm not sure. This includes Martin Travers illustrations. Now this one is a great resource. It has beautiful translations of some of the non-prayer book material. The problem that I have with this one is the layout. The layout is not easy and it's not good. So the hardest example is with the sung preface, in which you have to turn the page, I think, 3 or 4 times as you're singing the preface if you're going to follow all the words. So the introductory words, the sursum corda, and then you change the page for the proper, and then you change the page back for the ending of the sursum corda, and then you change on to the Mass. This, again, like the other, has the Gregorian notation for all the, these would be the proper prefaces for the Eucharist. This also has, and it may vary from edition to edition, but this one also has the Gregorian canon. That is the Roman canon, the one that goes back to the time of St. Gregory the Great when it was fixed there, because some parishes were using that rather than the 1928 Anglican Eucharistic prayer from the prayer book. And that really goes back to English practice. With the English prayer book, what you had is a dislocated canon. And it was thought to be a problem that needed to be fixed. The difficulty is that Parliament was not going to put out a new prayer book. There was an attempt in 1928 to do so. The Church approved it, but it failed in the Parliament, so it never became official, although it was authorized as an alternative book, and is still, I suppose, authorized today. I'm not sure. Or that might have been taken over by common worship. So the English, what they would do very often, and they kind of gave it a nickname, the interim rite, because it was thought that eventually something formal would be done along these lines. And that's basically, they did propose a very similar solution with that 1928 proposed English book. But the part after the words of consecration, the institution narrative, was pulled out and moved back, and an option is a post-communion prayer. And then the transition from the 1549 prayer book to the 1552 prayer book, the first part was pulled out and moved off forward, and that became the prayer for the whole state of Christ Church. That used to be a part of the canon, and is a very loose kind of paraphrase of the Roman canon. And so we have this kind of dislocation where the canon is spread out in these other places, and so the English wanted to put it back together. One of the proposed solutions was, well, let's use the Roman canon, but then the part that's covered by the English rite, we'll do that. So the parts that are unique to the Roman canon, we'll say that, and then when we get to the parts that are covered by the English rite, we'll switch to that, and then we'll switch back to the Roman canon. And of course, at that time, the Roman canon was said in a low voice, so people, and in Latin, so people didn't really probably hear it much anyway. And if they did, they would have to know Latin or be able to follow along in their book. And so basically, that's what the English would do. They would say the Roman part in a soft voice, and then maybe or maybe not get a little louder for the Anglican part in the middle, and then switch back. And it was considered that the Roman editions were kind of like private prayers of the priest. And so that's kind of how they got away with that. Well, let's look at one of the other editions. And I'm sorry, maybe I should do a separate video on this, but I did not bring over the English Missal. And that is kind of definitely a prize to have. The English Missal, like the Anglican Missal, was another attempt to do much the same thing. It had a little bit different strategy, and it was put together by different people, so the translations were slightly different. But the idea there, the Anglican Missal was the prayer book with the Roman stuff added in, whereas the English Missal, published by Knott and Sons, K-N-O-T-T, the English Missal was more the Roman stuff with the Anglican stuff added in. So it was a little bit different approach from the other angle. And it was considered that the more high or Anglo-Papalist congregations would use the English Missal, and then the more moderate Anglo-Catholic parishes would use the Anglican Missal. And who knows how much that's true. It might be just who offered to buy what. Who knows. The other Anglican Missal for the United States that's a lot better is this one, which is an older edition. There's a newer edition that's put out by Lancelot Andrews Press, which is a Western Rite Orthodox publishing house. And they basically republished the whole thing from cover to cover, but they added in some extras. They put in an appendix with some Orthodox feast day material and some extra, I think probably Sarum prefaces, which are very nice. So you have a unique preface for St. Benedict and St. Francis and St. Augustine, I believe, and even Elijah, because I think Elijah has a special feast day in the Orthodox Church. And then they also put in the canon section for the Western Orthodox Rite, which is very similar to the prayer book, but a little bit different. So they have a separate section for that, so you don't have to follow piecemeal the little additions. You can have it all laid out nice and neat. And that is referred to as the Liturgy of St. Tikon, because Tikon, the Patriarch of Moscow, before he went back to Moscow, was over in the United States, or in Canada, over Alaska, and he supervised the revision or examination of the American prayer book, and what tinkering they would need to do to make it acceptable to the Orthodox, which wasn't a whole lot. Maybe we should do another episode just on that, because it's interesting looking at what they decided to change and what they decided to leave. In any case, this is by far the better and easier layout. We talked about the difficulty of turning pages in the Anglican Missal and the American edition. Here, it's much better. Also, I find that the type is kind of just right in terms of the bold and the size, being able to read easily. So this is by far my preferred layout here. Again, you have all of the readings, you have all of the minor propers. I'm not sure if this is showing up on the screen. I might hold it up here a little bit and get a better view. Now this is different from the English Missal in that on the pages with the readings, with the propers, there's no two-tone text. It's all black. But you do get two-tone when you go into the Eucharistic ordinary, the ordinary of the Mass. It would be nice if it was two-toned all throughout, like the English Missal, but they decided it wasn't worth the investment. And so in all of the Anglican Missals, this one, the Anglican Missal in the American edition, and the Anglican Missal, at least this edition I have here, it's all black only, black and white only for the propers. And then in the Anglican Missal, it's also black and white only in the Eucharistic text, but that might be just unique to that particular edition. I don't know. Which could be a reprint. Let's see, let's look at the Canon of the Mass. This one is a little bit lackluster, I think, in its page for the Canon, because it's just a photograph of a window, which is not bad, but it's just not as attractive as some of the others. But again, the layout is very nice, I think. Easy to read, easy to follow. And again, the Gregorian notation for all the chants. Well, let's look next at the 1979 altar book. This was put out as an official altar book by the Episcopal Church with the 1979 Eucharistic Rite, and it's just called the altar book. But again, most people just out of habit referred to it as the Missal, what goes up on the altar. This again, much like the earlier one from 28, follows the look and layout of the prayer book. Get that there. When you get to the Eucharistic prayer, everything throughout the book is two-toned, so you have red rubrics and black text, but you don't have any graphics. You don't have any pictures, you don't have any engravings. You also don't have, like the other book, the more artistic drop case letters and little fancy touches that kind of make it very nice and pretty. But you have everything that you need. Now with this one, you have the beginning of modern notation in altar books. So this one you can see, for example, in this Eucharistic preface, everything is modern notation, but they decided to do something a little different here. Rather than have a fine 5-line staff, they just have 2 lines, because you don't go up a whole lot and down in the course of this tune. So they wanted to keep it closer to the words, because with the 5-line, it would be further away. And basically also they wanted to emphasize that with chant, you can start on whatever note you want. Doesn't really matter. And you go up and down from there. So a person who is singing and their voice is lower or their voice is naturally higher, just start where you're comfortable and go from there. You don't have to necessarily match as it's written on the page, just match the tune. And this has also, that's different from the others, some extra material in the back for Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and all of that. You do have, when it's necessary, because of how many notes are on the range, you do have regular 5-line staff notation for those parts, like here the Exultet. But you notice the Exultet begins with a 5-line staff and then switches over to the 2-line staff, because for this part, you don't go up and down that far. It's a very nice book, but none of the extras. Of course, with the 1979 Rite, you switch to a 3-year Eucharistic lectionary, which means if you're going to do everything like they did before in the altar book, in the Missal, that's a huge book. So nobody ever put together a 1979 Missal with all the minor propers and such. The closest thing was the Church of the Good Shepherd in Rosemont, Pennsylvania, did put out an altar edition for the Anglican service book, which was a traditional language rendition of the 1979 prayer book. And here, it's nice that they have, they don't have all the minor propers and stuff, but they follow pretty much the format of the 1979 altar book. They do have red rubrics, which is very nice to have. And also, what I prefer is they do have Gregorian notation. And it's not just copied from the old books, but it is redone to match all of the new different translations and words that are used in the 1979 book. And then, of course, rendered in the Anglican service book. Of course, it has all of the additional Eucharistic prayers and other materials that are a part of the 1979 book. It also has these drop cap paragraphs, which is a nice feature as well. So this is a pretty good outing, I would say. What else have we got here? Just a few minutes left. These are two special small books, you see, just very small. So this one is from the Anglican Missal, and it's just Holy Week. So it's exactly the same stuff that's in the big altar book, but there's a smaller book, so you can carry it around. For example, the deacon needs it over here for the Exultet, and the celebrant needs it over there for the collects. And so everything for the Holy Week is in this little book, which is a great idea. In fact, we need to do that again. Somebody get on that right now. And then there's this one also that was for the English Missal, that's just the Holy Saturday material. So it's a little bit larger and really designed especially for the Exultet. This is it's called the Sarum Mass Book, and this was put together by a Western Rite Orthodox group down in Austin, Texas. And it's published by what's called the Old Catholic Church in Texas. I don't know if they're around anymore. It's the St. Hilarion Press at the Monastery of St. Hilarion in Austin. I need to check out and see if they're there. It is a nice edition. It doesn't have everything. Basically, it doesn't have any of the propers except for the prefaces. It doesn't have all the readings and stuff. It just has the ordinary. So it's a very slim edition, and I suppose they published another book with all of the readings and so forth. But it's very nice. It's interesting translation, and also it is not the Roman Rite that was standardized after the Council of Trent, but it is the Sarum English use. Lastly, we'll close up with, for the 2019 prayer book, the Anglican Church in North America has put out two altar books. One is in publication now. The other one is soon to be published. I served on the traditional language subcommittee that put together that edition, and so I did the altar book version of the traditional language text. So I don't have a printed, published bound copy, but it should be very nice, leather bound and large print and two-toned and so on. And basically what I tried to do is stick as much as possible to the look and feel of the Pew edition. What we did do, and this printout is not two-tone, but the published version will be with red rubrics. So we did some drop caps. We did some nice kind of fancy ones. We found a nice fancy font. The font throughout follows the font used in the Pew edition of the prayer book, except for those drop caps. And then also we did modern notation, and I think it's going to be very, very nice. We didn't do graphics like we did in the contemporary version. I just wanted to keep it very traditional, and we try to make everything as easy as possible so that you don't have to flip back and forth. You just move forward through the book. And so, for example, the solemn prefaces that are chanted here are all laid out nice and large on 2 pages facing each other, so you don't have to turn pages. And I think people will like it very much. Maybe we can do another episode looking in a more deep dive on that. Well, that's about all the time we have for this show and tell. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. God bless.